Let's start working on submitting this recipe now. Let's give the recipe form an ID of recipe form. Above this form, let's add a status div and the ID of recipe status. We'll use this div to display a message to the user whether or not the recipe was submitted successfully. Open up the main.js file. This is the same file that should contain the rating submission. Let's listen for the form submission using the on method. We'll be given an event object. We're going to call the prevent default method so the form isn't submitted. We want to use Ajax for submitting the form. We're going to hide our form during submission so the user doesn't submit the form twice. Next, we're going to select the status div and add some HTML. Add a waiting message. I'm going to wrap this around some Bootstrap markup to make it look good. Just like last time, create an object that will contain our form values. To grab the values, you simply select the input fields by their IDs and use the val method to get the value. For the action, we'll set this to r_submit_user_recipe. Grabbing the content from the editor is pretty simple. When we included the editor, WordPress also loaded the tiny MCE object. We can grab the content by using this object and grabbing the current active editor and call the getContent method, which will return unsanitized HTML. Lastly, we submit this data using jQuery's post method. Remember that the recipe_obj is available to us and we can reuse it to provide the Ajax URL. Inside the response function, we'll be doing either one of two things. We're going to check the data object for a status property and check if its value is equal to 2. If it is, then we know that the form submission was a success. Otherwise, an error occurred. I'm going to update the status's HTML appropriately. If the submission was a failure, I'm going to show the form again. Before any of this, I'm going to console the response just in case. Let's handle the form submission now. Inside the main plugin file, let's add action hook wp_ajax. We have to append our action to this hook like so. The function we want to call will be the same name as our action. I'm also going to make this hook available for guests, as I'm going to allow for guest submissions too. Inside the process folder, create the file submit-user-recipe.php and define the function here. We'll need to include this file from the main plugin file as well. Create a variable named response. This will be an array that will contain the status. Set the status to 1. I'm going to perform a very simple check on each input. I want to know if any of the fields submitted are empty. If they are, I'm going to send back the response with the wp_send_JSON function, which will also kill the script. After this, I'm going to paste in some code. Pause the video if you need to. All I'm doing here is sanitizing the input. Keep in mind that most of our fields are metadata. So we create a recipe_data array just like last time. For the most part, I'm using sanitize_text_field to sanitize our input. However, we can't use this function for sanitizing the content. Instead, I'm using a function called wp_kses_post. In the resources section, I provide a link to a function called wp_kses. Let's take a look at this function in more detail. There are a few libraries out there in PHP that help with sanitizing HTML. WordPress provides its own solution, which is the preferred method for sanitizing HTML. The WP_KSES function is pretty flexible as it allows us to define what HTML tags are allowed along with what attributes and protocols are also allowed. It would be pretty time-consuming to have to re-enter what HTML is allowed every time we use this function. If we scroll down, there's a link to the WP_KSES_post function. This function actually does the same thing as WP_KSES, but instead uses the same filter for posts. This saves us some time. Since our recipe post is basically just a post, it makes sense to just use this shorter function. All our data is now sanitized and ready for insertion. Inserting a post is actually really easy. We don't even have to use the global WP_DB object to perform this task. WordPress provides a handy function called WP_insert_post. I'll provide a link to this function inside the resources section. This function will insert a post for us and even take care of sanitation just in case we forgot to do so ourselves. There's only one parameter, which is an array of arguments. There are numerous things we can set, but we won't be using all of them. The only required arguments are the content and the title. If we skip anything else, WordPress will fill the rest by default. This function will end up returning the ID of the post created, which we will need for adding post metadata. Create a variable named post_ID, and its value will be the value returned by the WP_insert_post function. Pass in an array, and we're going to define the following arguments. Post_content will be set to our content variable. Post_name and post_title will both be set to our title. The difference between these two is the name is used for the slug and the title is used for the actual title. Post_status will be set to pending. By default, this is draft. We don't want to publish this recipe. Post_type will be set to recipe since this is our post type. That's it. Feel free to read over the codex and set the rest of the arguments if you would like to customize this further. Next, let's call the update_post_meta function to set the recipe_data metadata. All we need to do now is update the status in the response to 2, and then output it using the WP_send_JSON function. Refresh the recipe form page and try submitting the form with no input. You should get an error. Now try filling all the fields and we should see a success message. You should also have your console open to check for any errors. If you've received no errors and received a success message, then there's one last thing we need to check. Go to the recipe admin page and see if our post has been added. Perfect. Let's view it in our editor, and as you can see, everything was inputted correctly, including the metadata. This is exactly what we wanted. Now we have a form where users can submit their own recipes.